nonpartisan speakers bureau that has been bringing the most politically relevant speakers to campus for over 50 years now, and we're so excited to be continuing that tradition virtually this semester. It is my absolute pleasure to welcome you all to this evening to our conversation with Dr. Anthony Fauci. Tonight's event is one of many occurring during AU Family Week, and we encourage all AU family and guests to continue to engage in all the exciting programming happening this week. For those of you joining us via Zoom webinar, please enter your questions in the Q&A function on Zoom. At the latter portion of the event, we'll be taking some of these submissions. Without any further ado, it is my honor to introduce our moderator for tonight's event, American University President Sylvia Matthews Burwell. President Sylvia Matthews Burwell is the 15th president of American University in Washington, D.C., and the first woman to lead the institution. Under her leadership, the university developed and implemented the 5-year strategic plan, Changemakers for a Changing World, became the first university in the United States to achieve carbon neutrality, and expanded research and scholarship, including completing our new Hall of Science. She previously served as the 22nd Secretary for the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, and prior to that, the Director of the Office of Management and Budget under President Barack Obama. She's held leadership positions in 2 of the largest foundations in the world, as President of the Global Development Program, and then the first Chief Operating Officer at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, and as President of the Walmart Foundation. Today, President Burwell serves on the boards of the Council on Foreign Relations and GuideWell, and is a member of the Aspen Strategy Group and the Aspen Institute's Future of Work initiative. She earned her bachelor's from Harvard University and her BA from Oxford University, where she was a Rhodes Scholar. She's a native of Hinton, West Virginia, and she and her husband, Stephen, live in DC with their 2 young children. President Burwell, the floor is yours.
Thank you for that introduction, Amrutha, and thank you for your leadership of KPU. And I'd also like to thank our AU Board of Trustees. A number of them are joining us tonight, including our Chair and Vice Chair, Mark Duber and Gina Adams. The Kennedy Political Union, for those of you who are new to our AU family, is a true gem of American University. They've been the premier nonpartisan student-run, student-funded Speakers Bureau here at AU for more than half a century. And every year they enrich our community by bringing the most fascinating and relevant speakers directly to our community. And they have kept that tradition alive and well with tonight's guest. I do have a confession to make. Tony Fauci's AU roots actually run deeper than mine. As he told all of us at commencement in 2018, AU is on his morning jogging route since he lives right in the neighborhood, which means he's been an unofficial AU Eagle for more than 40 years. And since he received his honorary degree at AU in 2018, that may be the record for the longest it's taken anyone to get an AU diploma. I've considered knowing Tony Fauci to be one of my life's great gifts. I first had the chance to meet him at the Gates Foundation, and a general rule of thumb is that if Bill Gates says someone's very smart, you should just listen. I got to know him as our nation and medical science worked towards a vaccine for HIV. And later on, our paths would cross again when I served as the Secretary of Health and Human Services. Tony helped us with our nation's response to the Ebola outbreak in West Africa and our response to the Zika virus. And I've often relied on his guidance and counsel as we prepared for future outbreaks of infectious disease. The entire Burwell family has treasured getting to know Dr. Fauci. And of course, that's Dr. Fauci, the person and the values he represents. This summer, as the Washington professional football team finally took care of and chose to discard their name and began the search for a new one, my daughter Helene had a suggestion. She said, well, he loves sports and he's a great example for us. So why don't we just call them the Washington Faucis? Dr. Fauci, I don't know if we'll get to that topic in today's questions, but it's certainly something to keep in mind for the future. Without further ado, I'm truly honored and thankful to introduce my friend and a tireless public servant, the director of the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases at the National Institutes of Health, Dr. Anthony Fauci. Welcome, Tony.
Thank you very much, Sylvia. It's a real great pleasure to be here. I appreciate the opportunity to interact with your group in this chat, as it were. So would you like me to make just a couple of comments, or would you want to just go right to the questions? It's up to you.
Tony, if you'd like to make a couple of comments, why don't we do that?
Yeah, I just want to say that we the big topic that we're all discussing right now, and versions of it will come up in the questions, is that we're now at the point where we're going to be entering into the fall and the winter season. And I would have liked throughout the summer, where we had a very difficult summer, as all you've known, to get the baseline level of infections to a manageable level. And we've not succeeded in that. We're now stuck at around 40,000 cases a day. And when you look at the map of the country, you could always say that there are parts of the country that are doing well. And there are parts of the country in which the test positivity is very low, which it bodes very good for getting into a situation where you're going to have many people indoors as opposed to outdoors. But again, if you look carefully at the country, you see that there are certain sections, states, cities, towns, counties, where you have the uptick in test positivity, which is a very good predictor of a surge of cases. So instead of going into the fall and the winter on a sharp decline down to a low baseline, we're actually going into the fall and the winter with some parts of the country ticking up, which will ultimately lead to not only more infections, but more hospitalizations and then community spread, which will ultimately lead to morbidity and mortality. So the message I've been giving, consistently for a long time, but much more emphatically over the last couple of weeks, is that as a nation, we really need to double down with the fundamental public health practices that we know work: the universal use of masks, the distancing, the avoiding of crowds, the doing things outdoors as much as we possibly can, as opposed to indoors, including restaurants and things like that, but also washing of hands. So we're really faced with a challenge right now. It's in our hands. Are we going to do it, or are we not going to do it? We could talk later about the scientific approach, which will help us, namely vaccines and therapies, which are becoming online now. And we're going to have, I think, some generally good news about the timing of vaccines that I'll try to get to you in an accurate way, despite the fact that there are multiple opinions out there. So I'll stop there, Sylvia, and I'd really be very happy to answer questions and engage in a discussion.
Thanks, Tony. And I'll do a few questions, and then we have a number of questions that were pre-submitted, and I'll work through those, and then we have folks submitting them. So we have sort of three different kinds of questions. And as we start, something that I know that is on everyone's mind, and it's a topic that many folks are talking about, and that is the president's diagnosis of COVID-19. And of course, want to start with saying that well wishes for fast and full recovery for both the president and the first lady, as well as all of the other folks who have contracted COVID-19 here in DC and around the nation and the world. But one of the questions that I have been receiving quite a bit, and it relates to a topic you just mentioned, which is it's about therapeutics, and the question of how one decides when and where to use a drug that has not yet been approved, and especially when doing that with the president. So Tony, thought we could just start, because I know it's something on a lot of people's mind, with that question of how does the government and how are decisions made in terms of experimental drugs? You and I spent some time on this in Zika, and I'm sure it's similar.
Yes, indeed. So it's important for people to understand that there are a couple of drugs now that have been shown in randomized placebo-controlled trials to actually be effective. And that's drugs for more advanced disease. I'll get to the drugs for the early infection, namely things you want to prevent the person from advancing, prevent the person from getting into the hospital. But the two that we have the best data on are remdesivir and dexamethasone. Remdesivir is on an emergency use authorization, which means that it can be distributed prior to full approval. It was shown in a randomized placebo-controlled trial that was run by the NIH that in individuals who are hospitalized and have a degree of lung involvement, documented lung involvement, generally early lung involvement, as opposed to very advanced, that it significantly diminishes the time to recovery, namely when you're able to leave the hospital. The other drug that has been shown to have a randomized placebo-controlled trial in 6,000 patients in the UK is dexamethasone, a commonly used glucocorticoid that is on the market and used for a variety of diseases. That has been shown in individuals who are hospitalized, on ventilators, or requiring persistent high level of oxygen, that it significantly diminishes the 28-day mortality. So we have 2 drugs for advanced disease. The president got both of those drugs because A, he was hospitalized, and B, his oxygen level did drop to a certain level that required essentially initiating and triggering the administration of these drugs. The other drug involved here are drugs that are given early in the course of disease. None of them yet have been demonstrated conclusively by randomized placebo-controlled trials to have an impact on blunting the progression of disease. Those are direct antivirals, convalescent plasma, which has a EUA, even though the clinical trials to prove or not its effectiveness are still going on, hyperimmune globulin, still in clinical trial, and then multiple types of monoclonal antibodies. Monoclonal antibodies are natural products that the body makes in which you can get the B cells or the antibody producing cells of an individual, clone them, and make unlimited amounts of this material. These are in multiple clinical trials, inpatient, outpatient, nursing home, and prophylaxis. We're waiting with really anxious optimism that those studies will show efficacy, because it looks like if they do, they could actually be a game changer, but we don't know yet how effective. The president got a monoclonal antibody from a company on what is called a compassionate IND, which means that it isn't an emergency use authorization, it isn't been licensed, but you can individually apply to a company on a compassionate basis to give you the drug. So those are the 3 drugs that he got. 2 of them are widely available for people if they want it. One of them, they would have to individually apply for this compassionate usage.
Tony, thank you. Shifting now to a question that I think many people want to understand, and it is actually about the knowledge of transmission. And how has our knowledge of transmission evolved? And what does that mean in terms of prevention? What should folks know as individuals? What should folks know in terms of a university? What should folks know in terms of the government's perspective, in terms of we've learned about transmission? What are the key things we've learned, and what does that mean for how we think about prevention?
Yes, we've learned a lot from the very first days where there was misinformation that this was something that jumped from an animal to a human and predominantly was a zoonotic that just jumped species. So if you stayed away from a wet market, you'd be okay. Then we learned, no, not so. It actually is transmitted from person to person, thought to be inefficiently transmitted. Then we found out, not so. It's transmitted quite efficiently from human to human. In fact, it is one of the most spectacularly efficient viruses in transmitting, as we know from the super spreader events. Now, the things that we've also learned that are critical, that we did not know in the first month or 2, is that about 40 to 50% of all the infections are asymptomatic. Namely, there are a large number of people who are infected, who have no symptoms, who do not know that they are infected. Then we found out that if you do modeling studies, a substantial proportion of the infections that are transmitted are actually transmitted from someone with no symptoms to someone who's uninfected. We know it's transmitted by the respiratory route. It's transmitted by droplets. Now be careful, because most people think droplets are when you go achoo and you sneeze or you cough. It has been clearly shown now that respiratory droplets come out of your mouth when you just speak, and it comes out even more when you sing. So you could feel perfectly well, be speaking to someone who does not know that they are infected, and you could have droplets coming out. The final thing we've learned that's now become clear, there was a lot of confusion on the CDC website about that, and that is, can it be transmitted by aerosol? So what's the difference between aerosol and classic droplet? A classic droplet is one that if I were here and I was 6 feet away from Sylvia that I see on the screen, and I was talking to her, those droplets would drop to the ground before they reached her at 6 or 7 feet. However, when you have aerosol, where the particles hang around the air, and this is particularly relevant in closed spaces indoor, which is the reason why my anxiety level increases as we get to the fall and the winter, because aerosol can hang around for more than just a second or two. It can be multiple seconds or even minutes. And we see that in certain epidemiological situations, one in particular in a restaurant in China, where people far distant from the index case that was infected got infected, very likely because the air conditioning recirculated the aerosol that was out of a person's mouth who was not symptomatic, and that was transmitted. So it's a highly transmissible respiratory virus.
And aerosol is a concern.
It is a concern. Once and for all, let's settle that. It is a concern.
As we're still on transmission, days. This is the other thing that, we see European countries, some European countries are now looking at 10 versus 14. Has that been established in terms of the evolution of the science on how many days we believe that people can transmit?
Yeah, it is still evolving, Sylvia. And the more we learn, the more we get more confidence of the bracket that we're in. So let's talk about incubation period. Let's say if I got exposed right now, that the median time for me to get symptoms would be about 5 days. The range is 2 to 14 days, okay? Now, so having said that, on doing viral isolation studies, that you start replicating virus in your nasopharynx and therefore are transmissible, usually a couple of days before you become symptomatic, and then for several days after. But what we have noticed that some people are symptomatic, but after a couple of days, you can't isolate virus from them. And you say, wait a minute, they're still sick. Why can't I isolate the virus? Because what you're seeing is the effects of the infection and inflammation or things like that. And that person may not be transmissible. So there's probably a bracket from a couple of days before you get before you get symptomatic to a few days after you've been symptomatic. Now, the big question is, what about people who don't have any symptoms? And it's very difficult to study them because you don't know when they got infected. So if you're studying me today and I have virus, is it because I got infected yesterday or because I got infected 6 days ago? And that's the thing that larger studies are going to be able to give us information about that.
Do you think the Atlantic piece that appeared that said we should do sort of backwards contact tracing in order to start gathering that information, do you think that's something that is going to contribute and should contribute to being able to answer those questions?
Yeah, I think it will. It's going to be a lot of work and a lot of people, that's for sure. Right, but it's worth it.
As we think about mortality and morbidity of the disease, I think one of the things we capture the numbers, and we know over 200,000 folks, in terms of deaths, and that part we've captured. In terms of people's illnesses in the short and long term, can you talk a little bit about what we've learned about the long-term effects for some patients and even the short-term effects for some patients?
Just tell them no. Okay. Just 1 second. I'll be right with you. What is it? Oh dear. No, I should have told her. Oh, I'm sorry.
Do you need to take the call? We can continue. If you need to take the call, go ahead and
no. Would you call back and tell her that I will call her as soon as I'm finished at 8 o'clock? Okay. I already spoke to. Okay. Yeah. You can very well appreciate this, Sylvia. You know what's going on. We won't say it publicly, but so.
I do, and that is why I'm highly empathetic. And if you need to go, Tony, we will carry on.
No, it's okay.
The question of illness and how much, what people are seeing in terms of the morbidity and the illness in terms of we I think know and track the deaths, but the question of people getting ill, how much they're ill, how, whether there's damage that occurs afterwards, what do we know statistically and analytically about that at this point?
Okay, so That's a great question. That's the core of a lot of misunderstanding about this disease. So I must say, as I think I may have mentioned to you before, Sylvia, I've been doing these chasing viruses for a very long period of time. I've never seen a disease that has 40 to 45% of the people who don't even know they're infected because they're asymptomatic. And then among those who are symptomatic, about 80% of them are mild to moderate disease. Let me explain what that means. Scratchy throat, maybe loss of smell and taste, get a little cold, a little ache, you stay home for a few days, maybe a week or so. You don't require medical intervention except calling up and talking about, with your doctor what you should do. 15 to 20% of them get severe or critical disease. Namely, they need to go to the hospital, or they may require intensive care, they may require intubation, and then they might die. Of the group that is in the severe to critical, the percentage of mortality ranges from a few percent to double digits. If you're on a ventilator in the United States, the chances are that there'll be about a 20 to 25% mortality. That's the actual disease, the broad range of disease. What about the duration and the after effects? There is a syndrome that has a name that I'm going to try and see if we can get the medical community to change, because it doesn't sound right. It's called long haulers. And long haulers are people who get infected, who clear the virus virologically, yet they were either mildly or moderately symptomatic. They may or may not have to have been in the hospital, but when their virus is cleared, they go for weeks, if not months. And we might not even know how long because we're only 8 months into it, but they go for several weeks or even a few months with a constellation of symptoms that are consistent in this group of individuals. It's shortness of breath, even though they don't have any pneumonia. I can't walk up the stairs in my house, even though I used to run up the stairs. Number one. Cough, fatigue, muscle ache, fever, a dysautonomia where your body temperature feels like you're very cold in a room or you're very hot in a room. Your autonomic nervous system is out of whack. And something called brain fog. Again, another bad word for a medical terminology. But what they report is that they can't concentrate. And as much as they try, they get in front of a computer and they can't concentrate. Now, the trouble with that is when people say that, people say, well, this is neurosis, it's psychiatric. But then all of a sudden, when you get scores and scores and scores of people who start complaining to their physicians, you got to take it seriously. So in that regard, we're doing a big study to look at post-COVID recovered people to find out just what the incidence, the prevalence, and just what the pathophysiological mechanisms are. But it's a real phenomenon, Sylvia. It's not people that are a little, neurotic. It's a real phenomenon.
No, this is why I asked, because I think it's important in terms of the recognition of what else the disease is causing in terms of things that people should know about. Tony, we're in the middle, and many universities are in the middle of figuring out the spring and how we think about that. And obviously the whole country is, whether that's K through 12 schools, it's businesses who are figuring it out. And what do you see as the path to more face-to-face, more normalcy? I'm not asking for when does it all go away, but what do you think are some of the things that we should use as measures in terms of taking steps, in terms of defining success?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's going to be a gradual evolutionary process that starts off probably in the early spring and then goes through next fall. And let me explain why I think that is the case. And I'm walking on somewhat uncertain ground because there are a number of ifs in this, but I think the ifs are things that we can address with some data. So right now, there are 5 vaccines that are being actively tested in phase 3 trial in the United States. 2 of them started on July 27th. Phase 3, as you know, means you're looking at efficacy as well as advanced safety. Those trials have a lot of people in them. The Moderna trial has 30,000. The Pfizer trial has 44,000. The Janssen or J&J trial has 60,000. So if you look at the modeling that you do of the number of infections that are distributed throughout the country and the sites where we're doing the test, you can project that it is likely that we will get an answer as to whether or not we have a safe and effective vaccines, plural, by November or December. It is conceivable that that might be October. I think that is unlikely, but not impossible. So let's assume that we know in November and December that we have a safe and effective vaccines. The government has already made a risky investment in producing doses before we even know the vaccine works. So by the time we get to the winter, we will have November and December. Let's just take the month of December. We'll have maybe a few million to tens of millions. As we get into January, February, March, and April, we will incrementally have hundreds of millions of doses, so that we likely, if all of these vaccines prove to be effective, because the total amount of vaccines that we have, when you include all of the companies, is about 700 million doses. Most of them are prime boost. One is a single dose. So if most of them are prime boost, with 700 million, you at least have the capability of vaccinating the 328, 330 million people in the United States. However, logistically, you're not going to vaccinate them all at once, because people are going to be reticent to get vaccinated until they see enough people vaccinated without any serious adverse events. So even if you project that it takes until the third quarter of the year to get enough people vaccinated to have an umbrella of safety, remember, as you well know, if the vaccine is 70% effective, that means 30% of the vaccinated people are not protected. If only half of the people take it, that's 70% of half of the people. So you still have a number of vulnerable population. So what I think you're going to start to see is that as we get more people vaccinated, and as the level of virus in the community starts going down, as we get, I'd like to say the spring, Sylvia, but I'm not so sure we're going to be there in the spring. I think it's much more likely as we get into the late summer and early fall that we'll have a combination of public health measures plus the really good chunk of the population vaccinated, that the level of virus in the community will be so low that we can start talking about in-person classes being the rule as opposed to the exception.
And as we think about the public health measures that we currently have, do you think that they can get case count down to a level where your basic public health tools can contain the disease, in terms of getting a low enough case count where basically testing, contact tracing, and quarantining and isolation can control the spread of the virus? So you have small numbers of increases, but not the kinds that we've seen, like 25% increases over the period of the last 2 to 3 weeks.
Yeah. Sylvia, this is my great frustration and pain, really. I mean that. I'm not trying to be melodramatic, is because we know that if we were a uniform and not such a heterogeneous country, but uniformly, if we had everyone have universal use of masks, distancing, no crowds, outdoors, wash hands, you wouldn't see the surges that we're seeing. It occurs because of the lack of implementation of simple public health measures. It's so frustrating because it's not rocket science. You don't need to lock down. And every time I say, I talk about public health measures, the extreme group that we know about say he's trying to shut down the country and destroy the economy. Nonsense. You could carefully and prudently open up the economy and use the public health measures to do exactly what you're saying. Because if you get the level down that's so low, when you get the intermittent cases, you can then effectively identify, isolate, and contact traces. But when you have community spread to the tune of 40,000 cases a day, forget about it. You're not going to efficiently do anything. So that's the reason why you almost want to say, okay, country, maybe 50% of you hate me because you think I'm trying to destroy the country, but do me a favor. Listen to me for like maybe 6 weeks or so and do these things. You would see the level of infection go down. Absolutely.
It is one of, I think, the biggest challenges that we face, that it's become a binary debate. And, that's one of the things that you and I spent lots of time on, whether it was any issue, I'm afraid, in the country, is just binary in terms of you're either for X or Y, where the truth is we all want everyone to be healthy and safe. And we all want everyone to make sure that we can get to a place where we can reopen the economy and do some of the things we used to do. But getting to the place where we can have that conversation, hopefully we will continue to move forward on that.
Yeah, but Sylvia, one thing that gets back, when you and I were struggling through Ebola and struggling through Zika, there were disagreements and our famous conference calls that you ran constantly. There was a lot of discussion, there was a lot of disagreement, but we always knew that the enemy was the virus. It wasn't the person who disagreed with you. The difference now is that people are forgetting that the common enemy is the virus. It's not my opinion versus somebody else's opinion. Because when you make things like public health measures an oppositional position, you've essentially lost the game. And that's really what we've got to get away from as we move forward.
And I think that's why I asked the question, because if you can get that case count down to where those tools will work. And, when we decided on our hybrid model early in the summer, the case count was at 20,000. It had gone to 70 at the point at which we had to re-examine our decisions. I'm going to shift now to a number of the questions from our community. And I'm going to do one that's from our students. I'm going to start with one that's from our students. And it says, what advice do you have for students who want to go into research, but are concerned about the way that science is being devalued?
Yeah. Well, science is, in some respects that are obvious, is being devalued by some. But the strength of science as a discipline is so enormous that although there are some that want to devalue it, if you have any inkling of going into science, and I always say this when I talk about things because I value greatly what people do outside of science, but if you happen to have any predisposition to science, it's really one of the most exciting and gratifying fields you could possibly imagine, the discovery of the unknown. I chose a scientific discipline where the discovery of the unknown is associated with health of the human species. But there's other science that has nothing to do with health, some of the physical sciences, which are just as valid. So when you hear me as a physician talk about science, I'm not only talking about the biological sciences, I'm talking about science in general, because it's such an extraordinarily exciting field that as much as people try and devalue it, no, they're going to lose that one because it's too exciting and too contributory.
Agree on all those points, and just would add, and here at American University with our new Hall of Science, it's going to be even more fun and great in terms of your ability to work with others in a cross-functional way. So we're all in on the science.
Good.
Another question that our students have asked, and I think you've described it a little bit, but there was a question that we talked about a second wave, and perhaps I'm not sure that second wave, I think we're just kind of in a place of a winter potential increase in cases. What do we think that actually looks like in terms of numbers? And you talked a little bit possibly about length. You talked about the vaccine timing, but how about that other part in terms of how we should think about, they've phrased it as what would a second wave look like?
Yeah, a second wave. And again, when people ask me that, I don't say a second wave, I see a resurgence of the current wave we're in, because the second wave implies historically like in the 1918 pandemic, where they had an outbreak in the spring, and then the summer was free of virus. And then in the fall, they had the second wave. Right now, a resurgence superimposed upon what we're currently looking at doesn't look pretty. The modeling, Sylvia, and I'm always skeptical about models because models are only as good as the assumptions you put into the model. But some of the models that have predicted things have actually come true. You might remember when we were having the daily White House press conferences, and we got up and said that, in fact, if we don't do the kinds of things that I was preaching about doing, we could have as many as 200,000 cases. And sadly, we have 200,000 deaths. And sadly, we have 210,000 deaths now. The models tell us that if we do not do the kinds of things that we're talking about in the cold of the fall and the winter, we could have from 300,000 to 400,000 deaths. That would be just so tragic if that happens.
Yeah, and I think for people to put that in context in terms of the number of people that die from the top killers in our country, in terms of heart disease and other things, we've already surpassed those that die from diabetes or Alzheimer's. I think people understanding the magnitude of these numbers, and if someone told you if you did these things, you could not, cancer, you would not get cancer, you would not die of cancer if you did
Right.
these things. I think putting it in the broad context is probably a pretty important public health thing that I think we sometimes haven't done as much as we possibly could. We have a question from Madison Wooten. What do you think the future of in-person colleges and schools looks like in this age of COVID-19?
I think it's here to stay. It's just in abeyance right now. We will get back to in-person. I think what we have learned, I know I've learned that the utilization of virtual meetings, I think even when we have COVID in the rearview mirror, and we're at that point that you said where the level is so low, we don't have to worry about it. I think the kinds of things, particularly on a college campus, the in-person interactions, the social and other developments that you have when you're in college, I think that's going to come back, and it's going to come back with a good, healthy force, because this will be behind us. I think for things like people that I do right now, I can just think of times when I've had to go to a meeting that was a 4-hour meeting in Chicago or wherever, where you go to National Airport, you miss your plane or you delay, you wait an hour or two, you get on a flight, you go there, you stay in a hotel where you can't sleep, you wake up the next morning, you do your meeting, and then you fly back. I'd rather sit in front of a screen and talk to somebody for an hour. I'd be much more productive. But it's very different when you're talking about young individuals who are developing the social and other interactions that are so important when you're in a college setting. I think we're going to get back to that.
Great. I'm on to vaccines, and a question about how do we think about a vaccine's effectiveness and safety? So if you were advising the folks on this, what should folks be asking and thinking about when they think about, is this vaccine safe for me, for my parents, for my grandparents, for my child? How should we, the public, make sure that we do our due diligence with regard to vaccines' effectiveness and safety?
Okay, so the way the process is now designed, when a vaccine gets approved by the FDA, it should be effective without a doubt, and it should be safe at least to the extent of the tens of thousands of people that were in the trial. So the way the process works, and I think it's important for people to understand this, because there's always the big elephant in the room right now is, are we going to have a vaccine trial, and all of a sudden is the government, whoever, the president or otherwise, going to say, okay, approve this vaccine because it's safe and effective, as opposed to really proven. That's not going to happen. And I'll tell you why it's not going to happen. Because each of the vaccine candidates has a data and safety monitoring board. This is a group of people for these vaccines that we have a common data and safety monitoring board. They are a group of people who are scientists, clinicians, vaccinologists, immunologists, statisticians, and ethicists. I picked the chair of that, and they then get the best people in the field who are independent of anybody else. At a predetermined time, according to the protocol, the Data and Safety Monitoring Board looks at the data, and they can make one of three choices. They could look and say, it looks good, but you don't have enough data to make a decision, continue the trial. They could say, I'm looking at the data, and there's more infections in the vaccine group than the placebo group. You better stop that study because it's dangerous. Or, you have enough infections with a distribution between the placebo and the experimental that this vaccine works. Now, remember, the only people that can look at that data are the unblinded statistician of the Data and Safety Monitoring Board. So if I decide, hey, I want to see the data, sorry, Tony, no data for you. Or if somebody else comes along and says, I want to see the data, they can't. Because if they do, they will break that protocol, and that will be very transparent and very obvious to everyone. So let's say you get enough data to say it's effective. Then you give the data to the company. The company applies to the FDA for either an emergency use authorization to do it quickly, or a biological license application, a BLA, which is essentially a license. The FDA career scientists look at those data and then consult with their advisory board, the VRBPAC, who are another independent group who look at the safety and the efficacy. If they say it's okay, then you go through the process of approval. At that point, everything becomes public. So people like myself and the many scientific investigators in the community look at those data. So if they're not up to snuff, everybody's going to know about it. So that's the reason why I say when the FDA ultimately approves this, I would feel confident in taking the vaccine myself.
Thank you, Tony. Benny has a question. What is the potential efficacy of the AeroNabs aerosol recently created by UCSF in the prevention and treatment of COVID? And will it have any use until a vaccine is developed?
We don't know the answer to that. I think he's referring to the aerosolized interferon beta. I think that's what he's talking about. If it is, that's been an experimental trial. We're looking at it right now in a phased trial that is being run at the NIH. So it's another one of those situations. It's got potential, but we do not know yet how effective it will be.
So another sort of bigger picture question that's come in is, what has COVID-19 taught public health officials about dealing with public health crises in the modern age?
Yes, it depends on what you mean by the modern age. If the modern age is the divisiveness that we experience in society right now and the politicization of things, that means it's really, really tough. That when you have a public health crisis, everybody's got to be pulling together in the same direction. What we've learned is that you cannot have such divisiveness and rancor and politicization of public health messages. It gets in the way of getting the job done. I've used an analogy that I learned, I was in an interview, and I'll tell you very briefly. It's that one of my daughters was on a crew team at Stanford, and she was actually one of the co-captains of the crew team. I didn't know anything about crew, Sylvia. I was a complete nerd about crew. So there were 8 people on an 8-person boat plus the coxswain. And the precision of everybody having to row together. If you get one person who, for one reason or other, is not in the precise rowing crescendo and the pace, you're not going to win the race. So to me, it's the same thing. Unless everybody pulls together, you may go fast, but you're not going to win. And right now, if we want to win the battle against this virus, you really got to be doing everything together, all in one, not some states doing it this way, some states doing it that way, some cities doing it this way, some cities doing it that way. We've all got to pull together because we're all in it together. That's what I've learned about that.
Well, Tony, I smile because as many who are on this know that in my notes to the community, I often use that rowing reference as a person who used to row in eights in terms of what it takes and that rhythm that you have to have exactly in terms of the precision. And the other part about rowing, which brings me to maybe one of the questions that we have, is that you have to have a firm finish. That's what makes the boat run. So you actually have to complete the stroke, and you have to complete what you're doing, just like we all need to get our flu shot and complete our public health measures. You need to wear the mask, do the distancing. You have to have a firm finish as you put that oar through the water. And one of our community, Winnie Simpson, just asked, what advice can you give students who have family members that don't adhere to social distancing and mask wearing due to their views that the virus is a hoax? Can you give our students any advice on how to work with people who are older and sometimes their own families who are unwilling to hear the public health advice? Any advice you have for our students?
Yeah, that's a tough one, but there's some principles that I use, is that you can't be critical of the people and take the stance of how stupid can you be to not see what's going on. That's not going to work. That's just going to push them further away. I think you should try to appeal to what you know, that there's part of them deep down that is able to rationalize and take a look and evaluate. And you just look at the statistics. I mean, right now we have 210,000 people have died and 7.3 million people have been infected. Globally, there are over 1 million people have died. That is not a hoax. You can't say that every country in the world, from people who are our allies to people who are neutral to people who love us, are all lying and saying it's a hoax. It's just not. It's a reality. Take a look at what happened this week at the White House. That is a reality right there. And every day that goes by, more people are popping up that are infected. It's not a hoax. It's an unfortunate situation when you see something like that, because that could have been prevented.
I'm going to stick with sports. Jacob Robbins asks, you're known for running. Why is it important to you? And what has it taught you? Does it inform your life work?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I've been running for decades. I started in earnest. I was an athlete when I was younger in school, but in high school, that is, not college, certainly. But when I got down here, I started to train and run, and I've been running now for, 40 years or so. I've run multiple marathons, a lot of 10Ks. And then when I got out of the competitive mode, I just run every day. I ran and ran until I got to a point where my bones didn't like it. So now I more power walk than run. But it is absolutely essential for my mental health. It refreshes me. It detoxifies me. It's almost like taking a metaphorical shower, as it were. You come back from an intense day of the kinds of things, either in front of the Congress or in the White House or in a lab. It's not the most easy thing in the world to do. And when I come home, the only way that I can continue and go over to this computer and kind of work on emails and do things is I've got to get outside, and I've got to get that feeling of what it's like when you're running. Just the way when I pass Sylvia running on New Mexico Avenue, she has that nice grin in her face, like something good is happening.
And it is. And we're both very fortunate to get to run on our beautiful campus in Arboretum that I know many can't enjoy right now, but that also helps in terms of the incredible beauty and being outside. As you said, it's about the running and the being outside, and lucky to pass you. One of our questions is from David Brostoff, and he asked, how should the United States and the rest of the international community prepare itself for future pandemics? What institutions or procedures do you think need to be put in place? And I won't preempt that question, Tony. Thank you for participating in the Council on Foreign Relations. We'll be putting out a task force report to answer just those questions on Thursday.
You know,
But you will answer the question for this evening.
yeah, well, it's important because what Sylvia just mentioned is to get a group of knowledgeable, committed people to look historically at what we've done, what we're going through now, and what needs to be done in the future, because we can continually improve. You know, we had a pandemic preparedness program that antedated this. We were judged by Johns Hopkins University as being the best prepared country in the world for a pandemic. And we are now done worse in the sense of got hit badly, worse than any other country. Now, what happened is that we were prepared in some respects, but in some respects, we were not. We didn't have the capability of doing the testing that we needed to do in the beginning. And we reverted to something that I hope that when all this is over, reports like Sylvie was talking about, and maybe I have the opportunity to speak a bit about it when we have time, is that you need a uniform response. You know, the beauty of our country with the federalist approach of the states having the ability and encouraged to go their own way, that's great for other things. But it is not great when you're dealing with an infectious disease that has the capability of going anywhere. And that's the reason why, you know, when I use that metaphor, when you look at the country and you say, if we are a big forest and there is a group of trees that are on fire in the southeastern part of the country, the people in the Northwest should not think that they are immune to disaster. We've got to be in it all together. So that's one of the multiple lessons that we can learn when this is all over.
Jennifer Marino has written in and asks, should we be worried about the holiday season? People may want to travel to see their families. Should we just stay put? We know that a number of our students, students who are sophomores, juniors, and seniors are actually in the DC area. And I think that's where that question is coming from.
Well, you know, Sylvia, I'm using my spell check in my computer brain because I have to be careful, because as you know, if I say something, it's going to be in the newspapers. Fauci says, don't do anything, or Fauci says, go around. So we got to be careful. You've got to take it as an individual case. It depends on where you are and where you are traveling. So,
and
let me tell you,
travel. Right,
exactly. So, and the reason why it's each individual case, I will give you a personal example, which, you know, I'm not encroaching on any privacy of my family. So I have 3 daughters in 3 disparate parts of the country. My wife and I would love to see our daughters, who are adult women, who we don't see very often. We would love for them to come home for Thanksgiving. They have said themselves, Dad, you know, you're a young, vigorous guy, but you're 79 years old. Therefore, I'm coming from a city where there's infection. My sister's coming from a city where there's infection. And my other sister's coming from the city. We would love to be with you, but you know what we want you to do? We want you and Mommy to have a nice, quiet dinner, maybe have a neighbor next door that always comes over the house that you know that's negative, and we'll send our love via Zoom. That's one family's decision. Otherwise, we would love to be together. You know, it's, do you want to take a chance? Do you have an elderly person who might have an underlying condition? Now, maybe you want to come in and quarantine yourself for a number of days or get tested a couple of times before you go in. But that's going to be kind of inconvenience because, you know, Thanksgiving is generally a 3 or 4 day clip. You know, by the time you travel, get there and go back, you're not talking about a couple of weeks. So we decided to make it a very, very closed family type of thing. That was my decision. I'm not going to criticize people who do it differently, but look at the individual situation in your own family and make a decision that way.
Thank you, Tony. One more question and we will close out. And this is Alyssa Cordero. How are communities of minorities and lower socioeconomic levels disproportionately impacted by COVID-19?
I'm glad we got that question in, Sylvia, because it's one of the things, I get pained by a lot of things, but this really hurts because it's a recurrent theme that society in the long run, measured in decades, has got to address. The disparity in disease burden, hospitalization burden, death burden is extraordinary, leaned against minorities, particularly African American, Latinx, some Native Americans, Alaskan Natives, and Pacific Islanders. I'll give you a statistic. If you look, first of all, you don't like to generalize, but as a demographic group, minorities have a greater chance of getting infected by the nature of the jobs they have. They are more likely to have jobs that put them in essential positions out in the community, interacting with people, whereas other demographic groups have a much greater chance of being able to do their job virtually or in a way that doesn't put them in a situation. So they have a greater incidence and prevalence of infection. When they do get infected, they have the comorbidities that are distinctly associated with a poor outcome. Poor outcome meaning hospitalization, intensive care, and even death. One statistic is just extraordinary. If you look at the rate of hospitalization per 100,000 population, Hispanics and African Americans are about 367, 369. Whites are like 70. So the difference between the two, because not racial differences, the social determinants of health, which allow someone from the time they're born to the time they're old to have a higher incidence of diabetes, obesity, hypertension, heart disease, chronic lung disease, and chronic kidney disease. It is always more in the minority population than in the non-minority population. And that's something that, if anything comes out of this outbreak, should be a societal commitment that enough is enough. We have to do things that are commitments for decades to overcome those social determinants of health. Otherwise, the next crisis, whatever it's going to be the same story.
I hope all our public health majors heard that as a clarion call for the kind of change that change makers from AU need to contribute to as we go forward. It is a problem that is acute right now, but as Tony has reflected, it is something that is underlying, that needs deep corrections in terms of health care, access to health, and the care that is actually given to those populations. So I think it's a great question to end on, because I think it's about one of the clear things we know we all need to do out of this. Tony, we know how busy you are. We are so very grateful for your time this evening, and grateful for everything that you are doing to make all of us safer and help us get through this more quickly. As I've said before many times, and as I said when you came, and you were my first commencement at American University, the honorary degree went to Tony Fauci, because I do so believe you are a national treasure in so many ways. And we are just grateful that you would be a part of our KPU, our very special KPU speakers that they bring. This is a special one because it is about our weekend to celebrate our families and our students. So we couldn't be more appreciative and enlightened in terms of a great conversation. So Tony, thank you very much.
Thank you, Sylvia. I appreciate your inviting me. It's been a great pleasure. And I will see you on the campus, as they say.
I will see you there. Thank you.